Welcome back to Faith in Focus. I'm your host, Nick Sales. Today we have on a very special guest. This is my good friend, Barrett Burgin. Barrett is an independent filmmaker who makes, would you say, unconventional LDS films?
Oh gosh, I mean, I don't know that I would even put LDS films as the moniker as much as I love thrillers, I love sci-fi, I love kind of cerebral stuff, and also my background is so rooted in sort of being a Latter-day Saint and having, you know, that theology kind of shape who I am, that I can't help but put those elements into my work. And so sometimes they show up, sometimes they don't. Usually they do, and it's often accidental to the point where it's like, okay, interesting. So kind of interpreting and wrestling with those things in a larger context.
I love it. Yeah, I love what he does. I met him. We're both in the Utah film community, and so that's where we met. And just through shoots that we've had together, we've had discussions and conversations. And I've realized that Barrett is a well of wisdom. In fact, amongst my group friends, we have called him, if he had any mythological powers, he would be a wizard, because he's just so good with explaining things in a way that are very easy to understand. And so we've had a lot of great gospel discussions and a lot of great gospel conversations, and we're going to talk about some really interesting things today that hopefully will do a lot of good and help people. But thank you so much for coming on. We're so grateful to have you. So first question that I have for you is, I know that there's a lot of people who feel like in order to be convinced of the truthfulness of the gospel, they need proof, or at the very least, they need some kind of evidence, or like peer-reviewed scientific evidence.
Yeah.
My question is, can you determine religious truths by only using peer-reviewed scientific methods?
No. I don't think you can. I don't think that you're supposed to. I don't feel if you take a step back and even look, you know, kind of outside of a faith context and just look at the function of spirituality or religion, that's not its point. That's not its usefulness. What you can do is use data or scientific truths or peer-reviewed evidence to understand that that's not the point of faith. And this is well documented. I feel like that kind of question about sort of approaching faith through this very evidence-based, like, okay, if I don't find Noah's Ark, you know, then I don't believe that ever happened. Or if I don't find any evidence of, you know, these stories in the Quran, then the Quran must be completely untrue and unuseful. That's not really the point, and it's the less interesting question. It's a very American, very Western, very material way of viewing the world. Now, I don't think those are unimportant questions. Just getting back to what you said, can you prove religious truth through the scientific method or you know, peer-reviewed evidence? Not at all. Noah's Ark is a good example. You know, you have this biblical account of Noah and the Ark, and we don't have really any evidence for a worldwide flood or you know, kind of this story of all animals going onto this ark. That's not really the point of the story. What we do have is plenty of historical accounts of a great flood from a bunch of different cultures around that time, and they all differ a little bit. So when I'm kind of considering the literal aspects of faith and of religion, those kinds of accounts are really encouraging to me and demonstrate that, okay, there's some truth to this account. I think something happened along the lines of what we learn, say, in the Bible. But it's the story and it's the account of Noah in the Bible that is more useful to applying to our day. That's the point of a sacred text. And were we to have all of the the full perspective, we would see where it fits into something that occurred. But, you know, even in the Book of Mormon, you have these examples within the text where the writers of the Book of Mormon are saying this isn't a history of our people. It's totally within the realm of possibility that ancient prophets wrote the Book of Mormon and got things wrong about the area at the time. Now, you know, what I'm saying would be considered classical apologetics, but being apologetic to a piece of sacred text is the point. That's how you're supposed to engage with it. You engage with the principles, you engage with the metaphors. Adam and Eve, for example, I find that account to be much more valuable to me in a sort of viewing it as a sacred metaphor, no matter what happened, no matter how Adam and Eve may fit into the picture. And this is also not without precedent. If you take a Latter-day Saint perspective, right, and you look at the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament to the New Testament, and then the New Testament to the Book of Mormon, to, say, Joseph Smith, it seems that God has this way of telling his people, That's actually not what I meant. I meant this. I meant this as a larger symbol or as a metaphor. If you look at Christ, everyone expecting him to be this kind of political leader to come free them. And then it's like, oh, I actually just meant freeing you internally, freeing you from sin. And they're like, what? That this, a very literal reading of the prophecies and of the text was like, this Messiah is going to come and free us. Same thing with Joseph Smith. Joseph Smith comes and disrupts sort of the conventional view of that time, Christianity at that time, sort of interpreting the Bible and the text this way, and says, actually, it's not exactly what you thought. This is what I meant in the larger scope. So, assuming it's true, assuming good faith, there's no question in my mind that if God reveals more or reveals himself to us at some point, it is going to be in a way that's that way, where we're like, okay, I didn't have the whole picture. That wasn't really the point of the whole picture. Yeah. I'll give you a couple more examples on this question if you don't mind.
Before you say that, that just makes me think of President Nelson. He one time said something that confused a lot of people. He said, the Book of Mormon is not a textbook on history, although history can be found within its pages.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people became confused on that because they're like, wait, it's not a textbook, like it's not historical.
Right.
He's like, no, I'm not saying it's not historical. I'm saying that you wouldn't study it the way that you would study a textbook.
Yes, and I would push it one step further. Even believing that there's historicity to the Book of Mormon, I would be willing to say it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how historical it is. It doesn't matter if it's historical. That's not the point of a sacred text. And I'm not saying that's where I stand, but in the larger philosophical, kind of view of religion, of sacred text, I think sometimes it can be confusing to people outside of an American context that we get so obsessed with, like, but did it have, like, does the Book of Abraham say that? It's like, no, it doesn't. It's the Book of Breathings. It says something completely different, and we'll come back to that in a minute. That's not the point. And for anyone to suggest, well, that's moving the goalposts and you're changing, it's like, you're right. That's any acceptance of deity, of a higher power. That is completely within the realm of possibility. What is God doing by changing the way he frames the things along the Bible and the Book of Mormon, if not moving the goalposts, if not essentially saying, well, the goalposts were never over there, and you were thinking that's where they were, and so now you're mad as we're expanding. But that, if you believe in a God that can do anything, then that's within the realm of possibility.
It's like when people ask Jesus Christ, well, what about the law? And he says, sucker, poof, I am the law.
Right.
It's like, well, what about the goalpost? He's like, poof, I am the goalpost.
Right. That's right. I mean, I realize that in a sort of reductionist material way of debating, religion, that's not helpful. And I understand that that's incredibly frustrating to somebody who, we're going to get to this too, who's deconstructed their faith and feels like this isn't what I thought, and now you're just changing it to change the question. You're changing the question so that the answer fits. And my point is yes, and I recognize that's incredibly frustrating, but if you're going to accept any existence of a God, you have to accept that that's within the realm of possibility. That there are, and we as religious folks have to also accept that. That's very hard for religious people as well, because they assume, well, I thought it was this way. This is what I believed, and everything was black and white. And so we'll get kind of back to that in a second.
And I think that brings up an important distinction of, realizing what is the difference between doctrine and policy, because obviously we know that policy changes, it has changed, it will change, but doctrine is something that is eternal, that has never changed, that never will change. Things like God is our loving Heavenly Father. That is a doctrine that will never change. It always has been that way. We are children of God. That is a doctrine of God that will not change, that will never change.
That's a good point, Nick. Although I would also say that while I do believe doctrine is unchanging, I think our perspectives around it and even sort of the edges of how it's interpreted change all the time. And a good example let me give you a good point. I do believe that God is our loving Heavenly Father. I love the Latter-day Saint idea that we're his children, that he ultimately loves us, that his work in glory is to help us. It's to help us learn from him and become as like him as we're willing to let him make us, right? I love the idea of a God capable enough and powerful enough to make a being like unto himself. That's incredible. That's beautiful. That said, it is a modern sort of a very 21st century Latter-day Saint, or maybe 20th century too, but 21st century particularly Latter-day Saint view that God is so kind and so merciful and so sweet that when you get the other side of the religion, when you get the tough, terrible, complicated chaos in life. The universe, for example, and I wanted to touch on this too, like if you know anything about physics and the cosmos and astronomy, like the universe is full of chaos. There are all kinds of animals that just like destroy each other and suck each other's brains out and stuff. And like God either purposefully created or allowed for the existence of this stuff. And so when you go through a book like the Bible, like the Old Testament in particular, like the Book of Mormon in some cases, and you have to wrestle with these really messy, complex things, it doesn't jive super well with our cultural interpretation of that doctrine, which is true, right? God's called the great and the terrible. And that really lines up with the Book of Mormon in terms of opposition of all things, the bitter and the sweet, and sort of this yin-yang idea, right? That God's not wrong or evil, but some of the things that we would find horrifying or kind of, terrifying are things that are within the scope of what God allows to have happen for the greater good. But because we focus so hard on God as our loving Heavenly Father, then when something doesn't feel loving and we don't understand it, it's very upsetting to us. And again, I go back to some other religious context. That's not necessarily true in all faiths. It's something we as the Latter-day Saints, I think, could learn and remember because it's sort of a forgotten knowledge.
And I think that some of those things are things that he allows to happen. And I think that other things are things that he intentionally gives us because he knows that through trials and through growth and through learning is the best way that we can become more like him and learn and grow. I would say that for me personally, the moments of growth and learning that I have been through the hardest, most horrifying trials of my life that could have very easily made me question, how could a loving Heavenly Father give me this? When in reality, I just maybe didn't see things from his same perspective and seeing, and now looking back and connecting the dots looking back, I can be like, oh my gosh, it totally makes sense that he would give me something like that. He wasn't giving me that because he's evil or condemning. He gave me that because he knew that's what would help me to grow.
That's a really good point, Nick. I'm glad you bring that up because the logical extension of that question, right, is something I feel like I wish we all grappled with more. How could God let this happen? I think for you and I, we might go through a really serious challenge and come out of the other side going, well, I didn't understand, but that was really hard for me, but I've grown. You have to be able to accept the idea for any of it to work. And again, I think this is an important way to engage with spirituality or the religion correctly on its own terms. For any of it to work, you have to accept you might never get it. You might never get some catharsis or understand that. Your lack of understanding doesn't take away from the possibility of infinite wisdom or God's ways not being your ways, and you're not going to get it, and it's not going to feel good, and it's not going to feel even necessarily right. I'll give you an example. For us to say, okay, how could God let this happen to me? I think begs the question, how could God let this happen at all? Any of these things. Again, you look at the pain in the world, the suffering. I mean, not to get macabre here, but like right now, as you're watching this, as we're talking, somebody's dying, somebody's experiencing horrible agony, things I won't even say that people are enduring right this second. That's happening all the time on earth. And this is the classic problem of evil, right? And I like getting to these, I like kind of boiling things down to these larger questions, because if you can get over that, then it informs the rest of everything, where it's like you're much more resilient of going, okay, I've already dealt with this deeper philosophical concept about God. Is God good? How can God allow these things to happen? Well, Latter-day Saint doctrine has answers to that are very satisfying to me. It's the classical, okay, is God all powerful and all good? How can he be both? If he's all good, if he's all powerful, why doesn't he stop all the evil from happening? That would mean he's not all good. It's a very simplistic way of looking at it to me. It's not necessarily apparent that all good is what we think is all good. It's not necessarily apparent that God is all powerful to the point that he can break his own rules. Latter-day Saint doctrine teaches that he even says, if God did not do X, Y, and Z, he would cease to be God. I, the Lord, am bound when you do what I say, right? And so there are larger concepts that have to be grappled with. If Abraham was even allowed to contemplate sacrificing Isaac, then there's a deeper thing going on here that's kind of ancient,
it's a lot more complex.
It's heavy. It's heavy stuff. And life's that way, and it's better to reconcile those things early on, I think, because when you're not in the midst of a trial. Because when you're in the midst of a trial, it's like, why are you letting this happen to me? My life was so good. My life was so easy. And it's like, hey, just remember that person who's screaming in agony right now, and probably wondering the same question, and when you can get over that hump of understanding that there's a larger purpose here, even as horrible and as complicated as it seems. When you have the eternal perspective, it makes sense of why those things are allowed to happen, and that in the grand scheme of things, our temporal, earthly trials and pain and the things that are allowed to happen cannot compare with the peace and the glory and the joy that come out on the other side. Before we move on to the next question, I do want to kind of give you a few interesting scientific concepts that I feel make a lot of room for the idea of a God. Now, a lot of times people will get frustrated and say, "Oh, just because we don't have an explanation for that, you're attributing it to God, right? In ancient times, as the sun and the moon go over the earth, it must be God. What else? What's the other explanation?" And then when we find explanations, it's like, see how that cancels it out. That's not my point in sharing these. It is to say that God very easily fits into the framework when scientific truth that's discovered opens the possibility of, like, I see how God is a factor in this. I hope that makes sense, right?
Yeah.
It's not that you can prove religious truth through science. It's that I think a larger and newer science show that we just don't have it all figured out. And so we think we've got it, and then we learn something new. It's like, gosh, that changes everything. Right. An easy example is the theory of relativity versus quantum mechanics. If you know anything about quantum physics or quantum mechanics, I'm no expert, but this is fascinating to me. Okay, so you've heard the term light waves, right? Light goes from A to B in waves. And if you think about this is called the double slit experiment. If you think about throwing a rock in a pond, it creates waves. If you put the rock in the pond, you see how the waves kind of move out from it. Light behaves this exact same way, right? It's in waves. It's not just from one point to another point and it stays there, right? If you throw two rocks in a pond at the same time, they create waves, and then these waves interact with each other and kind of create this pattern, right? So in the double slit experiment, we wanted to test how light behaves passing through two different slits, because if you were to shoot one, kind of move one particle at a time, putting a particle from point A to point B through a slit, the thought would be, okay, it will just create where we can observe where the particles interacted, it will just create two slits. You're just shooting it through slots, right? It has no way to interact with itself. You put one particle through one particle through the other, one particle through one particle through the other. Well, what's insane in this experiment is that when you observe how the particles line up, let's say you shoot 100 particles through these slits, the pattern it creates on the other side is a wave. What does that mean? How is the particle interacting with itself? That doesn't make any sense. It should just create two slits, and yet it's evidence of a wave, which suggests that the particle, more or less, can land in any position and then ends up somewhere. And this has been interpreted so many different ways. We don't understand how that makes any sense. There's nothing for it to interact with. That would make sense if you weren't shooting them through slits. And so what's even crazier is when you record this experiment on a camera, or when you watch this experiment with your eyes, the evidence is it creates this wave effect. But if you were to leave the room or turn off the camera and come back and having done the experiment, it's just two slits. So particles behave differently when observed. That's just insane.
That's mind-boggling.
So the way this has been interpreted, there's a number of interpretations. There's what's called the many worlds theory, the idea that when anything is happening and it's observed, it creates a new universe, right? This is where these ideas of multiverses come from, is that the particle's behaving like a wave because on the way it's interacting with every position it could have taken, which gives it that wave effect. It's those waves interacting, creating that pattern. There is what's called the Copenhagen interpretation, which is one that I really like, which is that a particle moves from point A to point B, and it has what's called a superposition. So it has every possible scenario, and then it ends on a superposition. That's the most likely position. But because it's interacting in every scenario, you basically have the chance for it to be anything. To me, that is a really strong case for free will, right? For the idea that agency exists. For the idea that something could have been something else. And classic determinism or predestination says it was always going to be that way. Of course, you could say, of course, the particle was always going to land at that spot. But it creates the possibility for the particle to go into all of these other places. Well, if anything is possible and it behaves a certain way when observed, this makes room for the classic question of like, how can God know everything, but also give us free will and free agency? Do we have a choice or not? Were we always going to make that choice? Well, not necessarily. There's 1,000 different possibilities Nick could have chosen on an atomic level, on a particle level, right? And it also means that it's possible that, when you interpret the atonement, did Christ pay for every sin we were ever going to commit, or did he pay for every sin we could have ever committed? Oh. Right? Suddenly you expand the possibilities. And to me, learning about the craziness of how those physics work, it resonates in me the same way that the gospel does. It's like I feel like I'm seeing the cusp of evidence for God, God's fingerprints, right? It's not that this can prove God. It's not that, because it's so inexplicable, it must be God. It's that it's like a rift in the matrix. It's like, that's really interesting that the universe has these mechanics that actually determine reality. Here's another one. Have you ever heard of the simulation theory? So simulation theory is the idea that if we ever built a machine that was strong enough, that was powerful enough to simulate a universe, right? We're you're building a simulation. Here we are with AI. We're not crazy far from this. If you were able to simulate a universe and that universe had all the laws of physics, and you were to kind of scrub along a timeline and watch these things happen because you give it all the laws, and it's a one-to-one simulation of our known universe, then mathematically it's almost inevitable that we're already in a simulation, right? People love this idea. A lot of times people love these ideas who hate religion and hate this old archaic conventional idea of God, but like simulation theory is so interesting and so cool. And the simulations go, ad infinitum ad nauseum. They go forever in both directions, right? Is that not kind of Latter-day Saint doctrine? I mean, is there a reason that simulation theory does not connect with this idea of gods and worlds and existences without end, that what makes one real and one not real, and determining the rules? I can easily see a divine presence and a divine creator in that scope of things. In fact, it doesn't make any sense without one. Finally, you look at all of the medical technology that we're achieving today, the fact that you can create a synthetic organ, or like a heart, some of the stuff we've been messing with in sort of reviving brain tissue, or reviving like organic matter. And to me, it's like scratching at the surface of some of these crazy biblical promises, like resurrection. I think my point is that we're not super far away from fulfilling some of the kind of ancient expectations of what God is. And let me be careful and say, I'm not saying we can create God through our technology, but it's rather that if we're scratching at the surface of things that ancient humans could only dream about, that they would attribute to the gods, to God, is that not God? Is God not in that somewhere? Can we not scratch the surface enough to go, wait a minute, science opens the door to miracles, opens the door to things that it's not what I thought previously. And if we can get even close to it, who's to say that God's not there already behind the curtain waiting for us? Yep, I'm here. This divine technology, this inspiration comes from me.
So basically, if I understand you correctly, you're basically saying that there is room for science and belief in God to coexist, and not only to coexist, but to coexist very well together.
Yes. I don't think science at all... Oh yeah, back to the original question. Elder Renlund talks about this, gaining a testimony as defined in Alma 32 is not the scientific method, right? The scientific method is meant to prove error. It's meant to find things that are not true, and you're trying to gain a testimony by proving that it is true. You're engaging with it in its own way. So they're not the same thing.
Yeah.
But I don't think scientific discovery rules out the existence of God. I don't think that's what it's even for. I think anyone would agree with this. New discoveries even make room for a broader interpretation. It's just that religion also has to broaden its interpretation of said thing. But we've done this forever. We've always had to reconcile new scientific discovery. The issue is when religion or religious people start to think that that's the point of religion. It should have an open door policy. And you know what's great is Mormonism does. Like, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has an open canon, is open to scientific discovery, even if culturally there's been some retrenchment or some resistance. Doctrinally speaking, and we have a long history of this, we are very open to whatever new discoveries might be, because it's not necessarily what we think. And that's really enabling. I think that's really empowering.
I think that's fascinating. And I think it's been interesting for me to see on my own journey and to talk to other people on their journey. I think that for a lot of people, we each have a threshold for how much evidence we would like to have. For me, I don't need a lot of evidence. I feel like my faith, my testimony does really well on its own, and I don't really need a lot of evidence to satisfy that maybe hunger or craving that I have. But I know that for a lot of people, they do have a bigger threshold for more evidence in their life. And so I think it's awesome to say that, for those people who are looking for deeper evidences or correlations between science and God, it's there and it exists if you dig deep into it. But that brings me to my next question, which is it possible for someone to gain a testimony of the LDS Church if they completely neglect feelings, emotions, if they completely close themselves off to a spiritual realm? Is it possible to gain a true testimony of the LDS Church?
No. And it's not possible to know anything by closing yourself off to those things. This, again, is supported both by Scripture and by doctrine. From a Latter-day Saint perspective, if we're going to assume truth in it, you have to engage with the thing on its own terms. And we're taught that it's not possible. And I'm going to give you that doctrine here in a minute. But also, the most current sociological data demonstrates that it isn't possible. So let me start with the spiritual, and then we'll talk about the science. And again, I like that you're asking these questions, because the science does not support kind of really conventional, ancient, almost mystical questions, right? About the Book of Mormon. I don't think those are the more useful questions. What the science supports is the right way to engage with the religion to find value, and the way that our brain works, and that we kind of need these examples. We need the mysticism, and we're built for it. We're evolved for it. And that, to me, indicates God, right? That is where I find God. If I were going to find him in scientific evidence. This is like, why is it all structured that this is the perfect way to do it? But let's talk about the doctrine. So Laman and Lemuel see an angel, right, in the Book of Mormon. They have countless witnesses and evidence.
Evidences.
Right,
yeah.
evidences. Oh, yeah, undeniable evidence. And it doesn't do anything for them, right? Alma the Younger sees an angel. And that's not what does it for him. He says in the Book of Mormon that where his conversion came from is the Spirit. The Spirit bore witness. Seeing an angel doesn't mean anything. When we look at dreams, our weird meter doesn't turn off when we're having dreams. But if you think about your dreams, they're so weird. You might see, somebody with like 3 arms and stuff, or you might just see crazy stuff, or you're flying around. And the reason that we don't immediately wake up because it's so alarming is we actually accept things in dreams pretty quickly. We go, oh, I guess that's what it is.
I guess I have 3 arms.
And if you saw something, you would accept it. You go, oh, I see that. I have a very good friend. I respect the heck out of him, right? Atheist, very healthy for me to grow up with 2 of my best friends, one agnostic, one atheist, me a Latter-day Saint. We'd get in these great debates. And props to him, he was very respectful and also really likes our faith. He's like, wow, I see a lot of truth there. It's typically actually only from within that we get so much kind of angst and frustration about how untrue it is. We're going to talk about that in a minute, why that happens. But I asked him a very similar question to something you told me, where I said, listen, man, like we were going back and forth on evidence. He was like, I need documentable evidence, right? And I said, answer me this. If an angel appeared to you and said, like, behold, God exists, would that be enough? And he really took it seriously. He thought about it for a moment. And he was like, no. So why not? He's like, I would doubt my eyes. I would doubt my senses. And I said, well, what do you make of that? And he was like, I mean, I already accept that it's not possible. That was his belief. That was his worldview. As much as I have a worldview that's a confirmation bias, his was already there. And truthfully, how can we trust our senses? Our eyes, our memory, the data demonstrates that we're not actually viewing the world as it is. We are interpreting it. Our brain creates an image and interprets it. And if you get a brain injury, you might look at your hand and it's like melting and stuff because your brain doesn't know what to do with the images, right? Your physical senses are not a reliable way to understand spiritual truth. Well, then what is truth? How can anyone know? It's through the Holy Ghost, right? The doctrine answers this, that you can receive a spiritual witness as a spiritual being in a way that we can perceive truth from error about spiritual things. And Alma the Younger doesn't cite the angel as his conversion. It's the witness of the Holy Ghost. It's the same reason that someone can say, I received a witness from the Holy Ghost. I can't deny it. It's not emotion. It's not the same thing. I think you do have to be emotional and open to it, but I don't think anyone can know anything by observation alone, not truly, not fully. Let me talk about the sociological data, though.
Can I touch on that for a
little
bit?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, you go ahead, please.
I just think that I've had several people ask me how I have received my answer that the Book of Mormon is true, or that the church is true, or even that God is real. And it's been hard for me to explain what that feeling is like, because obviously I wouldn't explain it as just warm fuzzies.
That's right.
I would explain it as a deep and profound spiritual experience that is so deep and profound that I cannot deny it. And the thing is that that's not a feeling that I can just give to someone. I can't just say, like, here, take this part of my brain and feel what I felt and replicate the deep and profound spiritual experiences that I've had, because that's not how it works. And so I think that I just know that for me, the experiences that I've had, I try to categorize them into, yes, they are feelings and they're emotions, but they're not just like, it's like, I would say it's similar to the way that I feel about my wife. Like, I love her, but it's not just because I think she's cool or because I felt good things around her. Like, I have had deep and profound feelings and emotions with my wife when choosing to marry her, or when proposing, or even now that we're married. It's something that I don't know how to explain it, other than the fact is I cannot deny what I have felt, and they've been deep and profound.
And those cannot be discounted. And we're, again, give me a moment to get to the data on this. But those cannot be discounted from an analytical point of view. We can't discount them. It is the most profound way in which we make decisions, and it's the most profound way in which kind of human experience and identity is structured, and it's vital. I want to touch on the fact, too, that this is a common religious argument, and it's, again, why I love Latter-day Saint doctrine so much, because it has an open door to this kind of thing. You know, often an easy sort of reductionist argument against, let's say, you having a spiritual experience is like, well, my Catholic friend has had that similar experience about their engagement with Catholicism, with the seven sacraments, with the Virgin Mary. What about my Muslim friend who has felt deep within his heart that the Quran is the word of God, and on his pilgrimage to Mecca had a deep, profound, and he would describe it in the exact same terms. What about my evangelical friend, or my Krishna, follower of Krishna friend who has seen miracles, and it's like, I can't deny what I've seen, and those two things cannot be true. Both can't be true. Do we have to say, well, it's not the same though. You haven't felt what I felt. Yeah. I don't believe that. I think absolutely they've had those experiences, because Latter-day Saint doctrine teaches there is truth in all things. Yeah. Their prayers are answered. If the point of life is to become a Latter-day Saint and join the church, then we failed miserably, right? It's like 0.0% of all humans have had that experience. If the point of life is to gain experience and to live a life in a physical body and here in a tangible earth and learn right from wrong, and then on the other side have things made known to them judged on what they knew to be right from wrong. And if Christ has a covenant people to do his work and to try to spread his gospel and lift the earth, then we're doing a great job of it. Mm-hmm. And I believe that those things can be true. I love the idea that the church teaches that take what truth you have and we'll add to it, right? And there are things that it's like, okay, these are firm boundaries. These are hard lines and principles. And there are things that are like, hey, and we could even do a better job of this, where it's like, let's take that, let's learn from that. It's called holy envy. Yeah. I love what this faith does. That's true. That belongs to the gospel.
Yeah, like for example, I love how the Baptists view grace.
Yeah.
I think that is beautiful, and I think that we need more of that in the church.
And we've been making a shift in how we understand and really getting more in alignment with the Book of Mormon,
Right.
which teaches it that way.
And I think there's a common misconception when we say that we are the only true and living church. And I think that what that is that a lot of people think that because we are the only true and living church, that dismisses the truth that the other churches claim to have.
Right.
And that's not it.
No.
Because they do have truth. We don't.
Yes.
Our church does not have a monopoly on truth.
That's right.
Other churches have truth as well. In the Doctrine and Covenants, it doesn't say we are the only true church. It says we are the only true and living church.
Right.
Meaning we are the only church who has a prophet who talks to God and is inspired of him and leads and guides the church, and no other churches have that.
And the importance of the priesthood authority
Right.
in our framework, which is very complete and makes a lot of sense in a restorationist type context. Both things can be true, Nick. You can have the one true and living church, all their creeds being an abomination, what that means. We're not going to apologize for the words of God, and yet also have the teachings of Joseph Smith and Brigham Young, embrace truth from wherever it may come, right? And all these things have truth, and it's not saying that somebody who has a religious experience that's not valid, or not even that it's like, oh, that's a pretty thing, but
Right.
come learn more. It's like you are engaging with God through a framework that he is allowing to have happen.
Totally. And I also think that doesn't mean that we are better than anyone
No.
else. I think that there's also a common misconception where it's like, yes, because we are the true and living church, all of the other churches are below us. And that's not true either. I love and respect all of my Baptists and evangelical and Muslim and Christian and Hindu, whatever faith that they have. I embrace the good that they have, and there is so much that I can learn from them.
For sure.
And I try to do the best that I can to not see them as lower than me or beneath me in any way, because I know that that's not how God sees it.
Well, it's not our church.
Right.
Christ is greater than us all. And so in that sense, it is his prerogative to reveal what he will, and we can't apologize for his words, right? He excuses not himself, but we would do well to understand, the covenant people is not that doesn't always mean the best people, and maybe it doesn't mean that at all. It just means that there's a special connection there. There's a responsibility, the greater light, the greater condemnation, the greater expectation, and that we've been called on to serve, and God can have his hand in many different places, different covenants with different people. Now, I want to be careful in saying that. I'm not saying that the ordinances of the gospel or the priesthood are just kind of one in a tapestry. It is essential, and yet its essentialism is not the only thing that matters in a wide scope of religiosity and spirituality in life. I don't think that our saying this will really matter to a lot of people, because at the root of it, there's a doctrinal difference, and even the Latter-day Saint idea of openness to truth and other faiths can be offensive to, say, an evangelical or a Protestant. That it's like, what about the way is straight and narrow, and there's only one way, and it's through Jesus Christ, and we can believe that as well. It's just that God, as Joseph Smith put, is so liberal in his understanding and makes a way for all. Or the Book of Mormon, he speaks to all nations in their own tongue. That yes, that way is necessary, but the way, in order to find him, his arms are wide open. Maybe the way is narrow, but his arms are wide open, and everyone will have a chance to do that and can engage with him in the language and the understanding and the faith which they're familiar with to get to the truth of the gospel.
I love that. I think that just kind of goes to show that there is a place for everyone in the church. Right. There is a place for those who are struggling with addiction. There's a place for those who have same-sex attraction. There's a place for those who have a bad habit or an addiction that they're going through. There's a place for those who are struggling with the historical facts about the church.
Yeah.
There's a place for everyone, and God's arms are wide and open, willing to embrace all of those and get them on that covenant
Yes,
path.
exactly. Let me do the second part of that question.
Yeah,
so
I think we got
is it possible for someone to believe the church if they close off their heart to feelings, emotions, and faith? No. If you read the work of Jonathan Haidt, he wrote The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Argue About Politics and Religion. He is a social psychologist, has presented pretty much the cutting-edge research on moral matrices, your moral matrix. Why do you believe what you do? Why can two people think that each other are completely off and evil, and they're wrong and I'm right, and both of them have perspectives that they're sure are true, that they're sure are righteous, right? Jonathan Haidt's research, I highly recommend this book. If you're going to argue with anyone, you don't have to agree with me. This isn't a religious book. Jonathan Haidt is a liberal atheist sociologist that wrote this work that I think is seminal. It changed his view on just kind of the scope of why people debate with each other. I generally won't debate religion or politics with someone unless they've at least kind of familiarized themselves of the research on why we believe what we do, just because it's not productive. But this is kind of the latest data and science demonstrate that we do not make decisions rationally as humans. We actually can't. Our understanding of why we make decisions has changed over time as we've studied it. Well, the proper way to approach decision making is purely rational, right? Just be as rational as you can and measure the data. And this sort of rationalist approach, it's not the only reason people leave the church, but it's one reason. Like you've talking about evidence, it's not how people make decisions. People make decisions based on their intuition, based on their moral intuition. Haidt compares it to an elephant and a rider, right? The elephant is the moral intuition that you have when you hear anything. And the rider is your conscious mind making up the reasons and making up for why we believe what we do. This is true of everyone. This is true of us as Latter-day Saints too. And so it's important to check ourselves. But generally speaking, it's demonstrable that someone makes an emotional decision before they bring any rationality to the table. They reject something. They think, oh, that's disgusting, or oh no, I agree with that wholeheartedly. And that's the elephant. The elephant turns to the right or turns to the left. And then the job of the rider is basically to make up all the reasons that they feel that way in retrospect. The rider kind of turns it this way and thinks that he's riding the elephant. The data suggests that smart people are not better at doing this, are not better at realizing that they do this. They are just better with coming up with the BS for why they have decided what they've decided. The data also demonstrates that someone who is strictly rational, let's say you had a brain injury and it kind of cut off the emotional centers of your brain. So now you're kind of the Sherlock Holmes type guy. That those people where that happens to,
Isn't that what has happened with like lobotomies?
Yeah, that's right. Yep. If an emotional center of your brain is turned off and you do become purely rational, it debilitates you. Your decisions are less rational than before because you're overwhelmed with. Actually, I'm not going to do a great job of describing it. You should read the book. But the idea is that. That purely rational thinking is actually not the most logical thinking. You need the emotion. We are evolved to have the emotion. And so because of that, oftentimes, this is true of ourselves and true of others, you can kind of discount all the reasons that someone might be laying out for why they're so upset about something. Truthfully, there's a deeper emotional issue that's not being met. The book also makes the case for why, kind of conventional ancient religious societies, some of these societies with all these rules and frustrations work so well because we have to engage with it on that level. And so Jonathan would make the same case that you can't just have a strictly rational approach to spirituality. You're not going to find fulfillment. You're not even going to make a very good decision. And I believe this is one of the reasons that some people get so upset about church history and why others can know all of the church history and it's not a huge problem for them. I think the issue is more of feeling like they were deceived or lied to, or the overwhelming cracking of, it's compared to a breaking shelf, right? I put those things on the shelf, it finally collapsed. Well, the overwhelming feeling of feeling frustrated about these things because it's not what I thought. I thought that the faith was X, and it turns out it's Y, right? Well, you don't want to blame the victim of having experienced that, but maybe the faith was Y all along. I mean, our Old Testaments have been sitting there in our laps all these years, and it's a freaking monster of a book. You have to wrestle with this thing, and you can come out the other side with a beautiful, broader understanding of God, right? So it's not to say that that's anybody's fault, because we as a church have kind of, like I talked about the loving Heavenly Father example, we've sort of presented it with a nice bow, and it's pretty, and it's this way, and we've kind of whitewashed some of the way we talk about the history.
I feel like we presented it in a very Disney-like way.
Very much so. Yeah. In fact, can I read a quote real quick?
Of course.
So this is from, I know I'm really verbose, Nick, so I apologize that I'm just rambling.
No, and while you're looking that up, I've realized that for me, all of the biggest life decisions that I've made have not just been from the logical side of my brain, but also the emotional side of my brain. Thinking about the woman that I chose to marry, the house that I chose to live in, the job that I chose to have, all of those things had logical aspects to them. But
of course.
But if it was just logically based, I feel like I probably would have made some very different decisions.
You'd have made a terrible decision because you're not trusting the intuitive side. You're not just accepting that that's how we operate and that that's an important side to things. Yeah. But I think that can be really useful. I don't think it's valuable to hear deconstructionist arguments about this data until somebody has read Jonathan Haidt, right? Until they've read the book and understand how you want to talk about peer reviewed and want to talk about research. Jonathan Haidt is extremely respected in the field. He's published in The Atlantic. He's one of the cutting edge sociologists on this research, and no one can really dispute the book, and you have to read it and understand what the data is. That's your peer-reviewed research. That's your scientific, data is demonstrating that to some extent it's demonstrable that people make these choices for emotional reasons. Us, we admit it, and people who leave feeling like, oh, there was just too much church history. There's too much problems with God existing. It's like that's not immediately apparent. It's just that we're engaging on it. We're engaging with it in this material way. And also, generally speaking, there's an emotional factor. Again, it's not to reduce somebody's arguments. It's just to say that is what demonstrably moves someone from point A to point Z.
And for people who feel that way, that's not a personal attack on them.
No, of course not.
That's just saying that's not a great argument to have because it doesn't make a lot of sense.
And it's not debating with the thing on its own terms. Humans are provably inherently spiritual. This is why you see so many people leaving organized religion and then getting into like astrology or getting into some form of spiritualism. They won't be able to get away from it. It's part of our design. So I could almost make an easier argument. I could make the argument that we're designed that way, ergo God designed us that way, and we are meant to be religious because it's a yearning for a heavenly Father, right? That's a good argument from within a faith context. I think I could make a stronger argument to say we are evolved that way, ergo you will live a happier life by engaging with religion and spirituality, and that's just demonstrable through the science. Sorry, like that's how your brain works, and that's an easier argument to make because that's where the data kind of shows it. Let me read this quote real quick. So this is from Adam S. Miller. He is a Latter-day Saint philosopher. I love his writings. I love his work. And I think this demonstrates what I'm getting at in terms of you have to recontextualize the way you've looked at the faith in a broader, less black and white way. If it is black and white, then of course your shelf is going to shatter, And I think this is maturing in open-mindedness and realizing that things are not always the way we assume they are, even if it's been taught that way, even if that's been the culture of the church. And of course, you can make the argument, well, how could the church be true if it taught me that way? Well, we're led by prophets. We're led by men. Nothing has been perfect. And there's biblical precedent. There's all kind of prophets in the Bible that are trying to figure it out the best they can with revelation, but God kind of lets us stumble along.
And there are even things taught to us by Sunday school teachers or even our parents who maybe didn't have it right. And we can see that they had good intentions with what they were teaching, but there's a lot of things that I was taught growing up in Sunday school and even from my parents that probably wasn't the right way of being taught that thing.
Right. Or especially there could be a better way. There's cultural function to the way those things happen. Even the things we're enraged about, there's cultural function. And if, as you look at the data, you see, okay, this is complicated. You kind of need the conservative retrenchment sort of, these are the way things are, the shame culture, the whatever. There is a larger societal function to those things. And you also need the progressive moving, changing, let's get out of that, let's evolve. You have to have both. They actually keep a society and a faith and a culture rooted in what's the most productive. You'll go kind of this way and you'll kind of move that way. But if you go too far in either direction, it falls apart. Yeah. Here's Adam Miller. He says, at some point, God will ask you to sacrifice on his altar not only your stories about your own life, but your version of his stories as well. Your softly lit watercolor feltboard version of scripture stories and church history must, like all your stories, be abandoned at his feet, and the messy, vibrant, and inconvenient truths that characterize God's real work with real people will have to take center stage. If they don't, then how will God's work in your hungry, messy, and inconvenient life ever do the same? When God knocks, don't creep to the door and look through the peephole to see if he looks like you thought he would. Rush to the door and throw it open.
So if you could summarize what that says in your own words, what would that be?
If faith is going to take root in our lives in a way that is useful and productive and causes us to be happier, we have to abandon our own version of what we think it's supposed to look like. We have to abandon the kind of Disney-like, feltboard watercolor version of what church history is supposed to feel like, or what the scriptures are supposed to feel like, and engage with the messy, complex reality of the gospel. Life is messy and complex. Life's R-rated, right? This is why I kind of get on my soapbox about content and as a filmmaker and in wrestling with broader things. Life is gosh, life's NC-17, and I don't think we have to go there.
Life is not a Disney movie.
But it's not a Disney movie. And I think it doesn't serve us. So getting back to the church history thing, I think that people who, and Richard Bushman makes this point, and I agree with him, children who grow up with the messy, complicated history, as well as the beauty, the simple truth, the rich and lightening gospel, and those things are woven together, right? And they understand the complexities of the church's history with polygamy and the racial issues and the choices that prophets or apostles have even made that are complicated and frustrating, as well as the miracles that accompanied them. When they have the full tapestry, they fare a lot better. And they have just as rich and just as deep of a testimony and conviction than somebody who grew up thinking, don't trust any of that stuff out there. The world is simple. Things are black and white. You'll always feel good. You'll always feel right. You'll have a good experience. Trust the simplest narrative of the gospel, and then to have that shattered by reality. Of course they're going to feel the way they do. Of course they're going to leave. They're going to discover all this history, and it's too much of an emotional experience, and it's too much that is inconsistent to what they thought God was, or what they thought Joseph Smith was supposed to be. Of course they're going to lose their faith. Their faith wasn't in something that is really rooted in reality. They would agree. They're like, I had faith in a lie. And I would agree with them because they had faith in something that didn't account for the nuance and the complication of these things. And you can engage with those things and come out better on the other side with a deeper testimony. Now, I'm not saying that children can handle really complicated things. In a sense, you can look at the Bible as an example of this. It's more functional for God to say the world was created in 6 days, and it was like there's light and then there's water and the firmament and all of this stuff. For ancient cave-dwelling hunter-gatherer people, if he's like, oh, in the beginning, atoms were split and existence came into reality, and went through all the science, it's not even comprehensible. and it's not going to stick with you. Stories stick in your mind. So in the same way for little children, we can look at, say, Bible stories, and we don't have to say, oh, now actually we don't know if the ark, really like where it landed or if it covered the whole world. There's all these accounts of, floods and stuff. You just tell the story of Noah's Ark. And then as you're older, you engage with it in a more mature way. And as a teenager and as a young adult, it might be like, oh gosh, like where's the evidence? And here are these things. But I think coming out the other side is to go, that stuff's not that interesting. What do I learn about myself from Noah's Ark? What is Noah's Ark a metaphor for in today's day and age? How am I likening the scriptures unto myself? And that doesn't get rid of gold plates. That doesn't get rid of seer stones and Urim and Thummims and a marvelous work and a wonder. But all of those things fit really well into the sort of mystical necessities that we have, that sociology proves that we have, in order to engage with religion in its fullest. But it's not the point of the thing. The point of the thing is how you're living, how you're behaving, what kind of person you're becoming, and then looking at the fruit of that. When someone is really living the gospel, and I mean truly, like living up to the principles we have. I'm not talking about just being active in church, just paying their tithing. They go to church on Sunday, they do all the things, they stand by the principles. I'm talking about the destruction of the ego, the giving away of oneself, the listening like Christ would listen, while also standing firm on the things he would stand firm on, which who can say which of us does that perfectly? No one can deny those are beautiful, wonderful people. Those are disciples of Jesus Christ.
I have a very similar belief when it comes to, and I've discussed this so many times on this channel, but it's the difference between armchair criticism and constructive criticism.
Oh, I've never heard. What do you mean by that? That's
interesting.
interesting.
Yeah. So armchair criticism is a term used for people who criticize a person or an event or something in the way that a person would criticize a sports team or a player or a coach or a ref, sitting from the comfort of their armchair when they're not actively involved in what's actually going on in the field.
Right.
When they're saying like, I could have done that better and he's doing that wrong. And it's like, okay, it's easy for us to say that. It is easy for us to critique the decisions of early church leaders or even the church leaders that we have now, and to sit from the comfort of our own armchair saying, I could have done that better or I could do that better, when you're not actively involved in it. And so that's what I see as armchair criticism, which my issue with armchair criticism is that it's not productive. It doesn't get anything done. It doesn't make me a better person. That's why I say that we should replace armchair criticism with constructive criticism, where we can say, okay, this person did this thing that I don't like. What can I learn from this? How can I grow from this? How can this make me a better person? How can I live my life in a way to where I don't repeat the same mistakes of the past? Growing up, I hated history class. I thought it was boring. I thought it was, I just didn't like it at all. It wasn't until in junior high, one day about halfway through the school year, the teacher stood up and she said, the reason why we teach history is so that we don't make the same mistakes that we've made in the past. And that's when it clicked for me. I was like, oh my gosh, I get it now. And so that's like when I study history, I don't just study history to say this person is stupid and I don't like what this person did. I like saying, this is why I'm learning this so it can make me better. Because I want to be better. I want to be more moral. I want to be more Christ-like. I want to be more loving. I want to be more like God. And I feel like learning from the mistakes of others, or even learning from my own mistakes and my own history, can help make me a better person. That's why I want us to replace armchair criticism with constructive criticism.
That's so well put. And you'll probably notice as you study history now, like, gosh, we sure repeat the same mistakes over and over. Yeah. I think, and I really like the way you put it. I think another way to look at it too is where's the criticism coming from? Is it a place of love? Is it a self-criticism like, let's do better? Mm-hmm. Or is it something where it's like, I hate that thing and here are all my criticisms for it? Mm-hmm. It's like, truthfully, you can objectively say it's a bad use of your time. It's like, just go on then, just do something else. Yeah. If you're trying to improve, like, and we have to be careful not to steady the arc. But if you're trying to improve an institution from a place of love, I guess I would say, like, let's roll up our sleeves and get to work. If your ward is frustrating you, go to your ward to serve. You're not there to be ministered to. Think of it as you're there to minister, right? You have the sacrament, you have the ordinances, and that's there. And then all the other things that might be frustrating about a ward. And I don't mean to be dismissive. I'm not suggesting this is what, people leave the church for, is, oh, I was offended or whatever. I know there are deeper issues, but I can definitely say with some confidence, within the church, we as members get offended all the time. And I just don't think that serves you, right? One of the covenants we make is not to evil speak about the Lord's anointed. I'm not convinced that is to protect the Lord's anointed from criticism. Right. I'm not convinced that is because
to
it will hurt them.
Maybe
Correct.
The wrong decisions that they've made.
Well, what I'm convinced of is that covenant's for us. It's like, they're not going to wither and die from criticism. They're not. It's like, and they get plenty of criticism. I think that covenant we make is for ourselves. We hurt ourselves by criticizing the Lord's anointed, because we learn something by learning how to navigate and go, okay, I do want things to improve. I'm bothered by such and such. But the moment I start leaning into that sort of armchair criticism, I think that sometimes my personal belief is that most leaders of the church are all leaders of the church, but are called through inspiration, and that most leaders of the church are wonderful, great people. My dad was a bishop and a stake president. I have watched firsthand how he changed and sort of the mantle of leadership. I have a lot of dear friends and leaders who have been close to me, who've helped me through very difficult things, who have been bishops and stake presidents, and there's wonderful 70s and are wonderful apostles. I say all that to say we also all know these stories about bishops or stake presidents every now and then a 70. You have Judas as an apostle, as an ancient example of someone who is called and then does reprehensible things, terrible things. Okay, why did that happen? Why was that allowed to happen? Aren't they called from inspiration? Wouldn't the Lord know their heart? Well, first of all, we have agency. Even Christ called Judas, right? But secondly, I think when we have a very difficult, let's say the middle, when we have a really frustrating bishop or a frustrating stake president, and maybe they're not, doing terrible things that'll get exposed, but they just bother us and we don't like their way of doing it. I think that is sometimes part of the point. God is calling imperfect people, and I think sometimes he calls, most of the time, this is just my interpretation, calls someone to minister who is righteous and inspirational and a model person. And then sometimes he will call a Paul who's frustrating, who pushes us. And it is this interesting relationship where we're all learning about leadership and godliness. And you look at some of the examples of prophets in the Book of Mormon, the brother of Jared or the later Nephi, where they ask God for something. God's kind of like, figure it out. What do you want to do? I'm teaching you both complete reliance on me, but also how to think and how to choose. And I'm not completely convinced that God does not often give an instruction and then leave it to his apostles or prophets to figure it out. Good luck. You're going to stumble along. I mean, that's certainly how I can make sense of a lot of the choices Joseph Smith made with plural marriage. That's certainly how I can make sense of the fact that the church will often change. Okay, let's take the Mormon thing, right? We're getting away from the use of the word Mormon, and we want to use the full name of the church, refer to ourselves as Latter-day Saints, which has always been the name of the church, right? The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. We're the Latter-day Saints. The church is the church. And one easy kind of pot shot that I've seen is like, oh, well, which prophet is true? Gordon B. Hinckley really leaned into Mormon. And now President Nelson's saying we're away. Did God change his mind? It's like, well, it's very possible that God gives inspiration and thoughts and ideas and then lets his prophets figure it out as we go. President Nelson makes some really good points about the church name. So did President Hinckley. President Nelson has very demonstrably felt this way for a long time. It's not outside of the realm of possibility. Here's it is changing the goalposts again, but I think it broadens the faith and the way God is allowed to work. We can't just set parameters on him. It's not outside the realm of possibility that President Nelson was inspired at that time. Like, I feel really moved to do this. And God simply picked somebody who felt strongly about that because he wanted that to get done at some point. Mm-hmm. And that finally, once he had the authority to do so, it's his call. God sustains him. God says, hey, I trust you. You do X, Y, and Z like Nephi, and I will sustain it. You make your choice, right? And instead of whispering to each prophet, hey, this is my new update, it's like God qualifies who he calls, and that's why you'll have a mission president do something one way, and then the next do it completely opposite. It's like, oh, did God just right that day and age change his mind? No, God's letting us try things. And as long as we're moving toward the larger, bigger picture that all leads to Jesus Christ, this is completely consistent with the New Testament. It's consistent with the Old Testament. And so to me, all of those ideas are wrapped up in why we don't evil speak of the Lord's anointed, because to do so is such a dismissive, simple way of approaching the larger picture here.
That kind of leads me into the next thing that I want to talk about, which is the importance of context.
Yes.
I would love, as a society,
segue.
I would love for us to embrace context on both sides. I feel like I don't want to turn this into like Mormons versus ex-Mormons,
No.
but I feel like it's good for all of us to embrace context, and let me explain why. I think that for those who have left the church, a lot of them say things like, oh, Joseph Smith married a 14-year-old girl, but they leave out all the context of realizing that it was actually her father that proposed the marriage, that there was no sexual intimacy or any relations there happening, that it was a spiritual sealing where his family was sealed to hers. And so that's something that gives context to the situation.
Yes.
That a way that I've heard it understood is that context is kind of like putting the rubber wiring on an electrical cable. It makes it so that it's not as shocking, right?
Right.
And you can think about that with a lot of different things. You could go up to a kid and you could say, "Did you know that there are people who are paid to cut open people's bodies and take out parts of their body?" Kids would be like, "What the heck? That's crazy." But then adding the context, you'd be like, "Oh, well, that's a surgeon. That's what they do. It actually helps people. It actually makes their lives better."
Right.
And they're like, "Oh, that makes sense," right?
Yeah.
Similarly, I feel like for members of the church, I think it would be really good for us to understand the context of why people end up leaving the church. No, it's not just because they want to sin.
Absolutely.
No, it's not just because they're lazy or they haven't done their research. I think that a lot of times we see people who have left the church, and this is not the case always, but I think that I have sometimes seen people who have left the church who become so bitter and angry, felt like they have been deceived, that they just kind of start barking. And
it's a reasonable feeling too.
Right.
I mean, do I think the church was actively trying to deceive anyone? Even that's a complicated question.
Right.
I think maybe there was some well-intention of like, well, we don't want to focus on this because it will hurt people's faith.
Totally.
And it makes a big mistake.
Totally.
But yeah, they've been deceived.
Right.
Like they thought it was this and it's not.
Yeah. And I've spoken to people who said, man, I just lashed out for years. I was just angry and mad and I would just lash out. And I'm not saying that everybody who leaves the church does this, but I think that it's important to give context to that situation and saying, I'm not crazy for doing this, but I also feel like giving context, it doesn't justify wrong behavior.
Right.
You know, someone who does lash out to others, even though you have the context of saying that they're going through the hardest time of their whole life, that doesn't justify any wrong behavior that they may do, or that doesn't justify that it is not okay to try to heal from trauma at the expense of someone else.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
Similarly with prophets of the church or people who have made mistakes or who have done wrong, terrible, horrible things, giving context doesn't excuse or justify maybe some of the wrong things that they have done. But what it does do is it helps us better understand their intentions and understand where they're coming from.
Yes. That's so well put. And I feel that context, one of the reasons it's so overlooked is it's boring. And it takes out the fire, you know? It's not conducive to, and look, there's nothing wrong with a hot take and a simple, well-put statement, you know? I mean, that's what's going to perform on social media. You're going to take the most kind of hot, short, succinct statements, and that's what will go out. But the truth is, someone will not get the full experience unless they watch the entire interview. They have to slog through all my long rambling, but to get to the larger point. Several things can be true at once, right? Joseph Smith and the 14-year-old sealing. You listed out a bunch of things that are historical and they're important context. Also, what's important is the law of adoption, and that kind of understanding of the sealing, this more of kind of horizontal and unifying family sealing, was a part of the theology at the time. And of course, if you're going to dive down that, you might break somebody's perception of that it was just all revealed this way and it's been this clean line ever since. You have to get away from the fact that it's really this kind of clean, perfect line that theology evolves and understanding of doctrine evolves and is revealed, right? You have to take into account that the time period, and I know that the time period that would have been unusual, but what would have been less unusual is the fact that this sealing was more like being betrothed in a spiritual sense, right? And then it's important to acknowledge that Joseph Smith made some choices as he was figuring out plural marriage that are hard and frustrating and are not particularly inspiring and don't feel like, oh, this is so great. Like, he made mistakes. I think we can all acknowledge that Joseph Smith made mistakes, but those things are not mutually exclusive. That situation, if you just tack that on as one last zinger, it's like, oh yeah, he there was that 14-year-old, and it kind of levels all of the context. It's like, well, wait a minute. And if we just have apologetics to make up for that one example without acknowledging that it was really complicated. Can I tell you a little story about Joseph Smith and plural marriage that I think is weirdly inspiring? And it's not a super pro Joseph Smith story, but it's a pro-God story, and you'll see what I mean. There, at certain points during Joseph Smith's plural marriages, he would marry women behind Emma's back because Emma Smith was so frustrated about this that he determined at some points, well, I'll just keep some of these a secret from her. She would really swing back and forth in terms of like, yep, I'm for it, and then no, I can't stand any of this. So he married, I think it was the Partridge sisters, these two sisters, and they had the wedding without Emma knowing, and so they were sealed to him. And Emma had been praying and trying to reconcile herself to this idea of polygamy, and so she approached Joseph Smith and said, "Okay, I've been praying about it, and I finally decided on two women that I think it would be okay for you to marry." And guess who she said? The Partridge sisters, right? Wow. And so Joseph Smith, like, not sure what to do. They just kind of hold the wedding again, they hold the marriage again. And there's a lot you can take from that story. You can take like, oh gosh, Joseph Smith went behind his wife's back, and that's not right. But you know what? God went and told on him. It's really interesting to me that it feels like sort of this kind of tacit like rebuke from the Lord, going and saying, I'm going to reveal this, my intention to Emma. The coincidence in the story, the sort of miraculous thing, is that those are the two people she thought of. You can interpret that story a number of different ways. You could say I'm doing mental gymnastics to try to find God in the framework. That would be a very fair take. But I think it's more productive to see where God's plans cannot be frustrated, even by a prophet who is trying his best to figure out what to do with this commandment, if we take it on good faith that that's what he's trying to do. That's a lot of context. That's a lot of context for the story. I also think that sometimes context can soften the blow, right? We know Brigham Young said and did things that were incredibly racist. Even if we get away from the priesthood ban and whatever its purpose was, or whether it was a mistake or whatever its function was, right? We can all agree that there are statements made by Brigham Young that none of us would stand by. I think some of the context of where some of that racism came from helps. It doesn't excuse it. It's absolutely reprehensible. But I think that it also helps humanize and understand where Brigham Young was coming from when you realize that a lot of this kind of terrible racist sentiment came at a time when the Eastern United States was trying to camp Mormons into their own ethno-religious group, into their own ethnicity, and say, you're not white. We're gonna camp you into your own ethnicity, as part of this terrible way of viewing the world at the time, where where sort of along the ladder of race, whiteness was this thing to be achieved. And after all of the persecutions and all of the terrible, being driven from place to place, the things that happened in Missouri, the things that happened in Kirtland and in Nauvoo, to know that the Eastern United States was trying to camp and to group Mormons into their own ethnicity in order to make the point that they were subhuman and like, among the other minority groups that they felt that they were terribly racist toward at the time. There's this famous picture of like all of these awful kind of racial stereotype depictions of all these children, and then this Mormon guy in the middle as like the ethnic Mormon. It gives some context to what Brigham Young was trying to do and sort of claim whiteness from the Eastern United States to protect himself and to protect the group. And unfortunately, what he did instead, which was a terrible choice, was sort of a punch down on the other minorities and be like, no, we're white American too. Doesn't excuse it. And you could even look at that choice and be frustrated by that choice, but you realize it's coming from a place of insecurity and desperation. And I think we can look at a story like that and look back and learn from it and go, how terrible that ended up being the legacy, if only maybe we had done something else. You can do that at the same time of realizing that you have an example in Moses smiting the rock, in that prophets make mistakes, and they're sometimes terrible mistakes. It doesn't make them not a prophet. It makes them someone that we have to wrestle with, and we have to disavow some things and hold on to the other things. It's also not really useful to center only on the things that Brigham Young said or did that are so frustrating, when there's so much that he did teach that we can claim and aspire to while acknowledging these problems, right? We will be better off if we listen to the things that were inspired by the Spirit. That's a hard thing to hear. That's a hard thing for Latter-day Saints to hear even today. Yeah. I risk some kind of going against the grain of the institution by saying that. But I firmly believe that it is in our best interest as a church and as Latter-day Saints to be able to wrestle with and acknowledge those things, and we can't do it without the full context. It helps to know why Brigham Young felt the way he did, even if we know it's wrong. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah. I think that's really important and really powerful, and something that I'm learning through all of this is that I feel like context even helps our own interpersonal relationships with one another.
Oh, for sure.
I have had guests on my podcast that other people don't agree with or don't like or this and that. And something that I've realized is that every guest that I've had on this podcast, there are things that I don't agree with them on. There are probably things that I don't agree with you on.
Sure.
But that doesn't mean that I'm not going to have you on. I feel like if I were to only bring on guests that I agreed on with everything, I wouldn't have anyone on.
Of course.
Like, for example, there was a guest that I brought on who has different views than I do on some of the stuff with the Word of Wisdom. And I just went on a trip with him, and we went to Arizona, and we had a good 2-hour-long conversation on why he believes those things. And that doesn't change my mind on what I believe, but giving the context of explaining why he believes those things, it helps me to better understand his intentions and realize that he's not against me. He's not against the church.
Right.
He just has a different understanding from it, and that's okay.
Yeah.
I had another guest on who, on his channel, he is very flagrant with his kind of approach towards anti-Mormons and ex-Mormons. And I felt like that's not the way that I would approach it. I think that he kind of has tactics that are different than the way that I would approach it. And I don't necessarily agree with him on that. But understanding the context of the situation and realizing that he gets sometimes hundreds of messages every day that are just very demoralizing and demeaning, I can kind of understand where he would come from and saying, okay, well, now I'm just going to fight fire with fire.
Of course.
And so, again, that doesn't justify or excuse any kind of wrong behavior.
That's a great example.
But that doesn't mean that I shouldn't bring him on his podcast, because I feel like ultimately he makes me want to be a better person and makes me want to grow closer to Jesus Christ. And so that kind of leads me into my next question, which is, I feel like you are a very wise person. I feel like you understand very well church history. You understand a lot of the rebuttals and claims against the church. Why do you choose to stay? Would you say that the pros of living the gospel outweigh the cons of not living the gospel? And if so, why?
I think on a deeper level, 1,000%. I mean, it's not easy. I grew up in the evangelical South, where I was sort of, I can't complain, because to some extent my identity as a Latter-day Saint was really interesting to people. And I wore it on my sleeve. I was proud of the fact. My upbringing was a minority upbringing. Now, I'm not going to compare it to being a racial minority or being a minority in my sexuality or anything, but being a religious minority in the evangelical South has comparable experiences. And that was both good and bad. In the good way, it gave me interesting answers when we wanted. Everybody loves to talk theology there, and I was able to have these missionary experiences and also just kind of be proud of the thing that was so mysterious to people. The bad part was that I was often told I was going to hell, often asked where my horns were, how many moms I had. In fact, my whole 8th grade year, I was like really pretty heavily harassed by a couple of people I thought were my friends, who just wouldn't let it go, wouldn't stop joking about the South Park thing. And it was nothing so defining that it like really hurt or ruined my life or anything. But if we're gonna use, microaggressions, for example, as a term, absolutely. Latter-day Saints outside of Utah often experience microaggressions or frustration. I still get it sometimes when I go to the Southeast. So because of that, I had to learn what I really believed and really do a deep soul-searching evaluation. I have a whole side of my family who aren't members of the church. I could easily kind of assimilate into that identity if I wanted to. But I have chosen not to, because I think on a deeper level, the beauty and the truth that I find within a gospel context far outweigh any kind of frustration I felt outside of Utah, within Utah, and in this time period. Great, I get to live during the time when not everyone, but a lot of friends and people in my generation are just falling off and are frustrated, and so much of the conflict's coming from within. But the peace that I feel, and the answers that I hold on to, and the witnesses that I've received. And you'll notice I haven't even talked about that stuff, right? We're talking about this kind of in hypotheticals and kind of from a logical standpoint, but those aren't the reasons I believe. From a young age, I've had experiences that are profound to me, that are pretty significant, that cause me to feel that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is true, that it is my religion, it's my background, and more than that the doctrines are true, experiences with Jesus Christ as the Savior that Help me to understand that while there are 100,000 different opinions about him and who he is and what he is, to me, I know he's my Savior. And to me, I know that he lives and that he exists. And knowing those truths, and then I guess the last thing, Nick, is like knowing my own nature, knowing human nature, and knowing kind of the choices that are natural to me and the choices that are tempting to me without the centering place of the gospel. And it's not a good argument to make that that religion is the only way that people are moral, right? There are plenty of moral people who don't need religion. And a lot of people take issue when you say like, oh, well, if you didn't have religion, why wouldn't you just kill everybody? Like that's a crazy thing to say. A lot of people are like, no, why would I do that? It is inherent to us to want to be moral. I actually see that as a kind of a evidence of God. And you could say it's evolutionarily advantageous, and I get that. But there is good evidence to suggest that people are more moral with a religious construct, that a society is more moral with a religious construct of some kind. And I know on an individual level, I am more moral because of the gospel of Jesus Christ, or I try to be. It gives me a perfect standard to live up to. From a less personal standpoint, from a more kind of hypothetical standpoint, I love Pascal's wager, which is that it is worth it to live a religious life, an examined life, because if you're right, in his kind of binary of heaven and hell, like if you're right, you're going to heaven, and if you're wrong, you'll never know. And the blessings that you see from living the gospel, I can't deny them, right? We live, and we know this, everybody knows this. There's never been a more, at least in our recent lifetimes, I guess I should say, at least in recent history, there's never been a more existential time period, a more nihilistic generation that's just kind of, and we see news articles about this all the time. It's like, what's the point? Suicide rates are climbing up and up and up. Social media is just kind of destroying everyone's minds, and existentialism is on the rise, right? Kind of postmodernism, metamodernism of like, it just doesn't matter, and try to be nice and be a good person. And the gospel anchors me in giving me purpose, in giving me structure, in giving me value. Forget the fact that I deeply believe it too, and believe in prophets and apostles. And I believe maybe a little differently than everybody believes a little differently. I believe in a way that I think makes room for the nuance and the frustration, and that not everything is quite as black and white as often I will find in my Latter-day Saint circles. But I'm grateful for those black and white views, because they create some structure to push against a little bit and go, okay, let's question this some. But in a time when when men's hearts are failing them, how is the gospel not a good thing for an individual? Now, I get it. A lot of people have had a lot of pain with the church. There are doctrines of the church that are hard doctrines, and they're only going to get harder. And that's maybe for another conversation. I mean, there's a lot of room to broaden, and there's a lot of room to listen and to understand and to change as people. And then there are places where I don't know that there is going to be room for that to happen, and I don't know what that looks like. I'm not a prophet, but I'm not going anywhere. Like, to me, this is my home. I'm proud of the heritage that I have, and it's not even my only heritage, but the heritage that I do have. And I'm proud of the fact that anyone can claim that heritage, and that we claim that heritage in a longer way, that we claim all religious heritage, and that the covenant people and the beginnings of Christendom and the Reformation, we celebrate all of it, and we can claim the good that's been passed down through countless generations.
I love that. You touched on this a little bit. I want to dig a little bit deeper with this. You mentioned a little bit of your relationship with Jesus Christ. I know that for me and for this channel specifically, everything that I do on this channel, I want it to revolve around and center on the Savior, on Jesus Christ, because I feel like so often we talk about a lot of great things in church. We talk about marriage and tithing and whatever. And even in this podcast, we've talked about context. We've talked about evidence, and those have all been great things. But I now want to kind of bring it back to Him, because Jesus Christ is the reason why we do all of this.
Yep.
He is the reason why the church exists. He is the reason why we are having this conversation in the first place. So I'm curious to know, what is your relationship like with Jesus Christ? How has that relationship grown, or even where would you like to see that relationship to continue to grow as you continue to live the gospel? What do you think about Jesus Christ? What are your thoughts on him?
Well, as I have done this whole conversation, I want to kind of answer it a number of ways. And I realize that it can be a little exhausting to kind of pick different parts to approach a question, but I think that's full context. I think that's a way to learn about yourself. So first from just sort of a symbolic sense, from Christ as a symbol, from Christ as an ideal. I think Christ is the archetypal ideal man, right? For and I don't mean man in the masculine sense. I just mean mankind, right? Human. I think Christ perfectly embodies. So I'm going to talk about Christ, and then I want to talk about my relationship with him. But embodies perfect gentleness and listening and kindness and meeting people where they are. It devastates me when I see so many examples kind of in broader Christianity and particularly the Christian right, where we can be so unlike Christ in the example that he set in sort of dining with those he did not agree with the publicans and the sinners, showing mercy, showing love, showing kindness. Go and sin no more, right? Neither do I condemn thee, but go and sin no more. Two perfectly put statements. I see Christ as inextricable with my experience as a Latter-day Saint, because one of Christ's purposes was to set up his church. I believe Christ's church is the way that we can access him in his larger mission. In an individual level, I believe Christ paid for my sins and loves me as a person, knows me by name. But on a larger level, Latter-day Saint salvation is not simply individualistic. It's a group experience. I'm an idealist. I don't know how it's possible, but I believe we can achieve Zion. I think that's what the point of the church is. And Zion doesn't happen until we stop pushing it off into the never-ending future of, the saints couldn't learn how to be in common, so right now I'm going to make an awesome life for me, and I'll do what God requires, and then one of these days Zion will happen. I don't think it begins until we learn to live a consecrated life, and that's a whole conversation. But I see deeply, kind of progressive liberal values in the classical sense in Christ, in caring for the poor, in opening his arms to the refugee, to the Samaritan, whoever the Samaritan is in your life today. Think of whoever that is that's outside of whatever your normal construct is, and you can apply that story of the Good Samaritan to that situation. At the same time, I see Christ embodying all of the best conservative values as well. That Christ came not to destroy the law, but to fulfill it. That he says, go and sin no more. That he says, be ye therefore perfect. That he says to Peter, get behind me. You cannot say those things. Or when Peter won't let him wash his feet, he's like, then you have no place with me. I mean, Christ's words are firm. He calls out hypocrites. He calls out a generation of vipers and the self-righteous. He condemns behavior outside of the covenant. And so I've talked about this a few times in this interview, but to me, you need both worldviews to blend in perfect synthesis to get a whole picture. And I think that's important to say right now, because we've never been more divided as a culture, as a country, as in the United States at least, and I know across the world. Right now, as we're having this interview, it seems that the church, on social media at least, and I know outside of it, is just falling apart and going crazy with political bias about high-profile individuals and members, and you've got people falling off on the left and falling off on the right. And so it's no coincidence to me that Christ embodies the perfect synthesis of those things when he teaches moderation in all things, when those who stand up as a voice of reason against binaries and against polar opposites are hated on both sides. As an individual, I love Jesus Christ. I love his gospel. I love that he knows me. He knows my flaws. He knows my weaknesses, and he loves me anyway. I don't feel distant from Christ. or God the Father. I've always felt that that when I pray, they're there. I know that's a gift. It can be a spiritual gift to have the gift of belief or the gift of knowledge, and I feel that I've always believed, and there's some things that I know, and that those kinds of statements can be broken apart and looked at and examined, and why different people have different experiences I can't speak to. I have friends who I know just have prayed their entire lives and haven't felt anything. It's not my place to tell them why that happened, to assume that they did something wrong. But for me, I know he's there. I know that my biggest struggle in life is trying to stay consistent and remember the Savior all the time in my day-to-day activities, because every time I turn to him, he's right there, and I know he remembers me. I think that Jesus Christ is the perfect unifier. I've noticed that when people leave the faith, when people are angry at religion, when people are angry at the church, at organized religion, at the Christian right, and everything that comes with it, and all the battles about race and identity and privilege and rights and what rights we're allowed to kind of stand for that may hurt other people. Generally, when people are frustrated about all that, they don't often take it out on Jesus Christ. I think bringing up the name of Christ does awaken something in every person who's ever been a Christian or been a Latter-day Saint, of remembering the beauty and the truth that they've once experienced. And I think that's significant. There's power in his name, which is why I support President Nelson focusing on his name. And I think there's power in remembering Christ and trying our best to be like him. I know he lives. I know that associating with the church and with Christ is only going to become more complicated as we live in a complicated world, and I'm not going to apologize for it. But I will always do my best as a media maker, as a filmmaker, as someone with a lot of opinions, to try to embody the best of his virtues. So I love him. I love his gospel. I love his church more than anything. And I say that in the name of Jesus Christ, amen.
Amen. Thank you. I really appreciate that. Something that I've been thinking about lately for the past few days is I've kind of realized that if people want to call me an apologist, sure, they can call me whatever they want, whatever. I feel like a lot of times as apologists, what we do is I feel like people attack the church or criticize the church or have something against the church, and apologists are kind of there to defend the church.
Right.
And I think that there's a place for that, and I think that that's
Absolutely.
good. But then I think about Jesus Christ, and I think, was Jesus Christ an apologist? Did he defend the church, or was he on the offensive? And I think that Jesus Christ was probably more on the offensive than he was on the defensive. And that has just made me think, in wanting to become more like him, what does it mean to be on the offensive? Does that mean to attack people? No. Does that mean to go after people or groups of people? No. What I've realized that Jesus did in being on the offensive is his fight was not against people. It was not against a specific person or even a group of people. His fight was against evil. Mm-hmm. His fight was against immorality. His fight was against Satan and the devil. And I've realized that that's what I want my fight to be against. I want to be at war, not against a person or even a group of people, because I feel like all people are my brothers and sisters. They are my tribe. Even those who have left the church, they are still my tribe. And I want to be with them. I want to be on their team. And so I don't want my fight to be against any individual person or any group of people. I want my fight to be against immoral things like armchair criticism or
Right.
ad hominem attacks or straw man arguments or
Absolutely.
loaded questions or exaggerations or things like that. And because I think that those things are immoral.
Mm-hmm.
I think that they are wrong. I think that they're evil. And I think that when we do those things, it's a win for Satan. And so I think that members of the church do those things maybe just as much as those who have left the church. And so my fight is not against people, or I'm not trying to take sides or do anything. I just want to fight immorality, and I want to fight evil. And I think that that's what Jesus Christ did. And that's why I want to become more like him. So
your goal in that, I think, is super consistent with the scriptures. It's Ephesians 6 that says, "For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. And I think it's clear that the New Testament is not singling out individuals. We're all children of God. It's darkness, it's Satan, it's wickedness, it's wickedness that's the enemy, right? And wickedness takes advantage of all of us. We can be wicked in our zeal to defend the church, right? That's where the word comes from, zealots in Christ's day who wanted so badly a certain thing that they started using Satan's tactics to defend God. And when God says he's not the author of confusion, I don't think that means these things are not complex. I don't think that means there aren't going to be paradoxes. Paradoxes are good. They teach you. It's Joseph Smith who said that truth is found by proving contraries, right? I love it when I find paradoxes all over the place in life and in the gospel, because I think that's the point of opposition in all things. That's the bittersweet where it's somewhere in the middle that you're going to find reality. When God says he's not the author of confusion, I interpret that as it's not of God to be in this chaos of confusion. It's Satan who is the father of all lies and basically the author of contention, right? And creating contention. I think it's important to say, Nick, that like anyone who views this, there's going to be levels of disagreement that are not overcomable, because we are still both speaking through the lens of a Latter-day Saint context. And that's sometimes the issue with someone, is they're too frustrated or too hurt or too angry or whatever it is, or too repelled by the church and their experience with it, that no amount of focusing on principles is going to overcome what is a deeply emotional issue with plenty of good reasons, right? The elephant and the rider are in unison. Yeah. However, I hope that people will look at the good you're trying to do by listening, by meeting in that Christ-like way, and at least feel something of like, hey, look, it's healthier for you. It is healthier for you to, if you've left the church, as President Uchtdorf, or as then President Uchtdorf once said, if someone in their quest for truth ends up leaving us, we wish them the best. Go and have a good life. Do the best you can. Try to reclaim the good that you had in this experience. I feel sad for people who are wearing themselves out in the frustration with the church, feeling like they're doing a good thing by freeing people from the prism of what they perceive to be a cult, of what they perceive to be a locked-in identity. I can say that from a kind of an objective perspective, like the righteous mind talks about, they feel like they're doing a good thing. And if the church isn't true, then maybe you could argue that they are. But it is going to wear them out. And it is not a healthy way to engage with the things that you've come from. So much better than if we can come together in peace and in love and try to meet in the middle of those things and lean into the greatest virtues that we're taught and raised, that they were taught and raised if they were raised in the church, of love and listening and compassion, and try to compare it to another faith, right? If you think about, kind of leveling an all-out attack on Islam, and it's like, I am going to destroy Islam. I feel like it's so unproductive, and there's all of this dangerous rhetoric and whatnot. We immediately bristle at that. It's like, whoa, wait a minute. Like, does the Quran have things that are tough and hard to swallow? Yes. Does any objective look at Islam show you that extremist interpretations are not the way that the faith is meant to be engaged with? Absolutely. That's why we have a word, Islamophobia. That's why it's so much better to find common ground and to celebrate the beauty and the diversity of it. Think of doing that with Judaism. I'm going to destroy Judaism, right? How terrible. I think we have examples of people who have felt that way, and look where it leads. Or the Catholic Church, right? It's tough when you've come from the context, when you've come from the inside of the organization, and you feel that in your experience, you were wronged and you weren't listened to and you were lied to, and somebody might have grown up with a way different bishop and stake president and youth, experience, and to them that is their experience of the restored gospel. But it's not going to be productive and it's not going to lead to happiness. I can say that with pure objectivity, to wear yourself out in being angry about it.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that that's not to say that they can't do that.
Of course.
Or that we will stop people from doing that. You can do whatever you want. It's just not productive.
We're better for the criticism.
Yeah.
We're better as a church for the criticism. So I am grateful. I actually get a lot of my information and a lot of my understanding of church history and a lot of my kind of, current events awareness from the critical side and knowing what was being said and sort of working that out. So criticism is not the problem, but it's the armchair criticism. It is the angry, really bitter criticism that, to me, it's like, this is making it harder for those who want to stay in the faith simply to have a space, especially those like you who are trying to engage, and it's making it harder for those doing it to let go and to live a healthier life.
Yeah, I agree. Well, I think that's the perfect place to end it. Barrett, tell the people what they need to know. Tell them what you're up to right now, how they can find you, how they can support you, and what you're doing.
Yeah, great. So I'm on social media. I don't have a very large social media presence. I should. I'm a filmmaker, but I'm on Instagram. My name's Barrett Burgin. It's at Barrett Burgin. I'm on Facebook. I have kind of a lurker Twitter account. Most importantly is you can find my films. My website is burgundy.com. That's my film production company. It's BURGINDIE.com. Burgundy. Last name's Burgin, and you can see some of my short films. I sold my first feature film last year called Cryo. It's a really dark, complicated sci-fi murder mystery, and it has all kinds of theological, kind of Mormon-y elements in there. It is not an uplifting film. It is not a faith-based film. It is absolutely a mental, cerebral wrestle with concepts, and that's what I like. And right now I am working on my next feature film, which is a pioneer horror film that plays in all kinds of spaces in terms of what we've talked about. And that's sort of what I think you meant at the beginning, is I can't help myself by imbuing that identity into it. But my hope is that any audience member could enjoy this stuff. So keep a lookout for my pioneer horror film.
Fascinating. I love it.
Years.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much for watching. Make sure you guys leave a comment down below. Let us know your thoughts. Leave a like, subscribe if you haven't already, and we'll see you guys in the next one.